Shalom. Giving all praises to the Heavenly Father, Yahweh Bahasham, Yahweh Shai Bahasham, Rahakwadash. Double honors to the apostles, the bishops, and the elders at Great Millstone who rule well. And as always, we give peace and salutations to the elect. And in today's lesson, I wanted to go over a biblical manner and custom. I'm reading this book here, which actually turned out to be pretty good. As you can see, they have the, name, or what is supposed to be the name of the Messiah, which they're wrong. Yeshua, A Guide to the Real Jesus in the Original Church by Dr. Ron Mosley. And pretty much what this book is going into is the Hebrew roots of what they call the Christian church, okay? The Hebrew roots, because a lot of people like to, when they refer to Yahweh Shai, when they refer to the church of Yahweh Shai, okay, they love to push the narrative that it had nothing to do with the Jews, and that's false, all right? They make this statement that all of the Jews deny Yahweh Shai, which that's a complete lie. Okay, a large number of them denied him, but to those who received him, he gave them power to be the sons of God. That's in the book of John. And again, the prophecy lets you know that the tents of Judah would have to be raised up first. Okay, the tents of Judah would have to be raised up first. So Yahweh Shai's initial following were Jews, all right? And by Jews, all right, you had, all right, the remnant of Judah, Benjamin, and Levi, who came from the Babylonian captivity, all right, to the Medo-Persian captivity, where they were able to rebuild the temple, through the Greek captivity, where many of the Jews were Hellenized, to the, Roman captivity, which, from the Greek captivity, you have the Maccabean revolt, okay, and not all of the Jews fell to the, heathen customs of the Greeks. Many of them fought. You have those stories in the book of Maccabees. This is history you must know to understand the New Testament. Again, a lot of people open the New Testament, okay, and the last book in the Old Testament is Malachi. Okay, so what most people do is they skip a whole beast. We like to bring this out all the time because it shows you how inept the so-called Christian church is in teaching these scriptures. Now they're, trying to embolden themselves and jump up and act like they're authorities when they've been pushing a false doctrine and leaving out history. Again, in order to understand the New Testament, which wasn't written at the time that Yahweh Shai was on the scene. Okay, they were quoting from the scrolls, the Torah, the prophets, the law. Okay, but eventually the church of Yahweh Shai would be established, and it was established first by Jews. Peter was a Jew. Okay, John was a Jew. These were all Jews who were born of the circumcision, meaning they were born to families who knew, all right, they were Jews and knew and kept their customs. Okay, and this is a big, this is something that must be understood, because again, they like to take the Israelite, the Jew, and then they like to tie the Jews to all 12 tribes. Again, the Jews represent the southern kingdom, all right, or it's just one tribe, Jew, the tribe of Judah. But at the time of the Assyrian Babylonian captivity, all right, they were called Jews, okay, the Jews. Anyway, in this book, he goes into some customs, pretty good stuff. I highlighted some things, but I wanted to bring out this custom because basically what he's going into in this chapter, as you read it, see if I can get a few things. I haven't recorded a video like this in a while, so bear with me, but let's see if I can find something. Give me 1 second here. See, I have something highlighted here. Let's see what I have here. All right. Basically, this chapter is called Jewish Idioms and Ideas in the Teaching of Yahweh Shai. So what they're doing is they're going into particular talking points and particular things that were said by Yahweh Shai that has their roots in, all right, the traditions of the Jews. Okay? And I read here, it says, binding and loosing. Now we read in a book of Matthew, the 16th chapter. And let's get the 19th verse, where Yahweh Shai is speaking to Peter. Okay, it says, and I'll get this in the NLT around right here. It says, now I say unto you that thou art Peter, which means rock, and upon this rock I will build my church. And Peter was born of the circumcision. He was born to a family who stuck to the traditions. How do we know that? Well, in the book of Acts, when he thought the vision of the unclean beast meant to eat those unclean beasts, what did he say? I've never eaten anything common or unclean or unlawful according to our laws, right? But the vision didn't mean actually eat those things, which is taught by the Christian church. It was speaking of accepting the scattered Israelites who have been raised as heathen, and that they will be cleansed through the blood of Yahweh Shai, and they will be accepted, which was something that, was kind of forbidden. That was not kind of, it was forbidden for those who were raised as Jews to mix and mingle, all right, with the Israelite foreigners who they looked at as complete heathen and castaways. They looked at them as unclean according to the law. Now, to get to the point, it says, and upon this rock I will build my church, and all the powers of hell will not conquer it. The gates of hell will not prevail, basically. And I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you forbid on earth will be forbidden in heaven, and whatever you permit on earth will be permitted in heaven. Okay? Then he sternly warned the disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah. Meaning Yahweh Shai didn't want, fame. But again, when you read it in the King James, this is how it's worded. Okay, verse 18, and I say unto you, thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. And I will give unto thee the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatsoever thou shalt bind in earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatsoever thou loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. All right, so, and we know that this word keys in the Greek is kleis. And when you go into the word kleis in the Greek, it means what? To be given authority. So authority was given from the Most High to Yahweh Shai and passed down to his disciples, starting with Peter. All right. Now, the talking point of things being loosed in heaven and earth is what we're going to get into. All right. As well as Matthew, the 18th chapter, in the 18th verse, he says it again. It says, verily I say unto you, whatsoever ye shall bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatsoever you shall loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. So I'm going to get into this custom of what this is actually talking about. We know it means authority. We know Yahweh Shai was given authority to, forgive sins, in which the wicked scribes and Pharisees had a problem with that. Okay? But what does this actually mean? It says, the second example is an idiom found in Matthew 16 and 19, where Yahweh Shai gives Peter the keys of the kingdom and says, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. For years, this text has been greatly misunderstood, causing much confusion throughout Christendom. All right. In the laws of the Jews, because we don't claim Judaism. Okay, we know the Judaism as it stands is a mixture of, different religions. Okay, but really what he's talking about is the law of the Jews. Okay, that was their customs, their culture, the law, statutes, and commandments. All right, it says in the laws of the Jews, however, all right, or the customs of the Jews, it has been long understood to be a legal designation during the days of Yahweh Shai. Okay, these antonyms were used to describe certain religious decisions. The term bind means to forbid, and loose meant to permit. There are numerous examples of this rabbinical literature To understand this, we must know that first century rabbis or teachers or masters, right, were constantly called upon by their communities to interpret scriptural commands. Now, before Yahushua came on the scene, the religious leaders of the day were the wicked scribes and Pharisees, man. And people would come to them about matters, and they would use those matters to put people in further bondage. Okay? They would take laws, okay, and use them to keep people in debt, keep people, they would, extort people. This is why Yahushua was cursing them out in the book of Matthew, the 23rd chapter. You're full of extortion. Okay, they were basically using the law to keep people in bondage, man. Okay? And there's particular laws within the captivity you're in that you may not be able to follow. All right, they were using the law. They were going into the Hebrew letters and making laws. They were binding men to particular traditions. Okay? And these were the leaders. These were the superstars of the day, but they were complete assholes. So the Church of Yahushua, all right, as a matter of fact, when you get Matthew, the 23rd chapter, let's get an example of what I'm talking about. Okay? Get a quick example. Matthew, the 23rd chapter. And let's see here. We're going to start at, let's see here. Let's see. Let's see. Okay, the verse I'm looking for is actually right here. Sorry, it says, they crush people with unbearable religious demands and never lift a finger to ease the burden. You see that? That's what they were doing. Okay? They had people in bondage. Okay? But when Yahushua came, again, he came to ease. Okay? He came to loose. Okay, the followers of the true worshipers of Yahweh. All right, through him, he came to loose them from bondage. It does not mean that, all right, you can just live the life you want to live. All right, but let's get into it. Let's just read this. It says, to understand this, we must know that first century rabbis were constantly called upon by their communities to interpret scriptural commands. For example, the Bible forbids working on the Sabbath, but does not define what specific activities constitute work. Okay? You had an example in the wilderness where a man picked up a stick on the Sabbath and was stoned. Okay? Imagine being up under that burden right now. Okay? But we've been loosed. Okay? Because, you may have a believer that's able to not work on a Sabbath and stay home. That may be someone's situation, but that's not going to be everybody's situation. So do you call in every Sabbath until you get kicked out or fired? This is what particular camps push. We keep some Sabbaths, certain people going to have to work. So what do? You have to lean on the blood of Yahushua, because if you don't keep the Sabbath perfectly, you're subject to death or being cut off from your people. This is why the Jews looked at the Gentiles or the Israelite foreigners as heathen, because they weren't keeping the Passover. They were born uncircumcised. They were doing all type of satanic rituals in Rome. Okay, so to hear that their sins can be forgiven through Yahushua's sacrifice, okay, that caused the stir. And this is the back and forth you see in the New Testament between the Church of Yahushua and the religious teachers of the law. Okay? Anyway, to get to the point, it says, as a result, the rabbis or the leaders ruled as to which activities were permitted on the Sabbath and which were not. Okay, so there are leaders set up through the Spirit, all right, who can make certain decisions through the Spirit and put down particular demands and orders. Okay, which some of them you're not going to be able to technically go into the Bible and find it. You're just going to have to listen to the order of the leader. Okay, the no sex on the Sabbath, although we can go scripturally and prove that. Well, David in the showbread proves that. Okay, there's various examples. all right, the leadership gave the order, it should just be followed. All right, although we can go into the scriptures and prove it, okay, because the Sabbath day is to be kept holy. And again, keeping these laws don't determine whether we're going to make it or not, but obedience is important. Okay? It says this: as a result, rabbis ruled as to which activities were permitted on the Sabbath and which were not. They bound or prohibited certain activities and loosed or allowed others. And see, this authority is given unto the church of Yahushua, start with Peter, the 12, and then you have 144,000 more, okay, which have the ability through the Spirit, and it's done in order. All right, you don't just come up, start coming up with your own. No, you everything must be done in order. But again, they had the ability through the power given unto them by Yahushua, okay, to prohibit certain activities and loosed or allow other activities, okay? Peter was given the keys or authority to bind and loose concerning scriptural questions concerning the early church, within the early church. An example of this practice can be found in Acts, the 15th chapter, during the controversy over whether the Gentiles or the Israelite foreigners should be permitted into fellowship without first being circumcised. Okay, there was a big stir. You can get Acts, the 15th chapter to read that, right? And you had many Jews, even certain Jews who believed in Yahushua, that were like, no, they got to be circumcised. So there was a big fuss. So an order had to be made, all right? But the order came through the leadership. And let's keep reading. It says, okay, it says, after the apostles and elders convened in Jerusalem, all right, Peter showed, and this is what happened, all right, there was so much friction and hell going on that Paul and Barnabas left Antioch to go to Jerusalem to settle the matter. They needed, they brought the matter to the leadership, the 12, start with Peter, and they were like, what do? We got all of these new comers, okay, these Israelite foreigners. They were raised uncircumcised. They're descendants of those who fell away to the Greco-Roman customs. What do we do now that they are listening and believing and they weren't circumcised? Do we force them to get circumcised, as these particular wicked scribes and Pharisees were coming amongst the churches and trying to imply? Or what do we do? Okay, it says, after the apostles and elders convened in Jerusalem, Peter showed an example of loosing when he ruled that both the Jews and Gentiles, and the word Gentile just means ethnos, ethnicity. Okay, they're still Israelites, but they weren't counted amongst the stock of the Jews, because guess what? All right, they were looked at as heathen. There was a big friction. Remember in the book of Maccabees, okay, Mattathias slew a particular Israelite who was doing a wicked sacrifice. So that was a history. When you go into the history, the Maccabees were putting those jakes who fell away to heathen customs to death. Okay, that was a very, very serious offense to them. So you got, hundreds of years later, you got some of those very members that fell away now being able to be welcomed back into the fold through Yahushua. That caused a lot of friction. Okay, but you have an example of Peter loosing when he ruled that both Jews and Gentiles were saved by faith, since circumcision was only a part of the first covenant. You can read that in Acts 15 and 19. And that actually goes back to Abraham, but there is in the law, it says if you're not circumcised, you're cut off from your people. So technically, in a technicality, these Gentiles, according to technicalities, should not have been brought back into the fold. First of all, they weren't keeping the Passover. They were involved in all type of idol worship, which would basically cut them off from being Israelites forever. All right, this is why we have to lean on the faith of Abraham, because again, if we apply the law to us, we're still Israelites. You could say, well, I didn't know. Well, if we apply those laws to us under that first covenant, we should be cut off outside of circumcision. We were adulterers. We didn't keep the Passover. If you didn't report to the Passover, you were cut off under that first covenant. So all of these technicalities can be applied to us, but through Yahweh Shai and the authority given to his men, right, we're seeing an example of a covering, of a loosing, okay? And this power that this church is given under Yahweh Shai is only going to grow, okay, until we get authority fully in the kingdom to judge and rule the whole earth. It says, Peter showed an example of loosing when he ruled that both Jews and Gentiles were saved by faith, since circumcision was only a part of the first covenant. Acts 15:9. Then James, the pastor of the church at Jerusalem, gave an example of binding when he required the Gentiles to abstain, all right, from the four characteristic practices of pagans. And that's where you get Acts, the 15th chapter. See if I can pull it up here. Acts, the 15th chapter. And what did he say in the Acts 15 and 13? As a matter of fact, we'll just start at 19. Okay? This is what James said. It said, wherefore my sentence is that we trouble not them which from among the Gentiles are turned unto the Most High. Among the Gentiles. These were Israelites scattered among the Gentiles. But we write that they abstain from pollution of idols and from fornication and from things strangled and from blood. Now, these are laws. You're not supposed to bow to idols. You're not supposed to commit, all right, fornication, all right, by doing all kind of wickedness or about, dealing with other gods, which that's what was going on in Rome. You can get Romans, the first chapter, to see what the Israelites got into in Rome. Okay? And from things strangled, all right, animals that are strangled. There was a particular custom to how our animals were slaughtered. And from blood, okay, which the blood, they were drinking blood. They were, partaking in all of those wicked sacrifices. But right here, all right, they were bound. This is how ultimately you're going to be brought in. You're going to stay away from idols, okay? You're going to stay away from fornication. You're going to stay away from things strangled and from blood. Okay, and this is ultimately when you get it in the NLT. All right. And my judgment is that we should not make it difficult for the Gentiles who are turning to God. Instead, we should write and tell them to abstain from eating food offered to idols, which there were various rituals tied to eating food offered with idols. Because the priest of those left-handed gods would do sacrifices, all right, in rituals. Then they would sell the meat in the shambles, okay? But the Jake, before they came in, they were partaking in the actual rituals tied to these things. So it was best that they stay away from it altogether, from sexual immorality and from eating meat of strangled animals. So when you have a Christian coming to you saying basically we don't have to keep the laws, bring this out. Because right here, James is binding them. Okay, he didn't loose them from these particular commands. He said, this is ultimately what you're going to partake in, okay, as a foundational point to build your faith on. But you can't come into the church of Yahweh Shai and then say, well, I'm going to still bow to idols. I'm going to still be a sodomite. I'm going to still eat, what the hell I want to eat. Okay, I'm going to eat bloody steaks. No, that's not right. So you talk to these people and you bring these points out and they'll say, well, nigga, you crazy. So if I don't eat this, I'm going to hell. If I eat this, I'm going to hell. No, you're not given the okay to do these things. For these laws have been preached in the Jewish synagogues in every city on the Sabbath for many generations. Okay, then the apostles and the elders, together with the whole church of Jerusalem, chose delegates, and they sent them to Antioch of Syria with Paul and Barnabas to report the decision. See? So there was an order made. Okay, and that's the understanding of binding and loosing. That's just one understanding. Okay, and you have leadership today. They give particular commands. It's through the Spirit. Even in the wilderness, Moses gave a command through the Spirit to tell Israel, put fringes on because you keep going off. Maybe if you see the fringe, you'll continue, you'll remember to do right. Okay? That wasn't in the 613, but that was given as an ordinance down from the leadership, all right, through the authority given unto them by the Most High through the angel that was following them. All right, and then it goes into different examples as well, you know. Maybe one day I'll bring some of these things out as well, but I just wanted to get that. I'm only 2 chapters in. I'm trying to get back into reading, but hopefully y'all were edified by this lesson. And again, that concludes, all right, the binding and loosing. Now we know ultimately judgment is going to be given unto the men of the Lord under Yahweh Shai. All right, and this authority, okay, like particular Christians will come up to us and they'll say, well, how do y'all know y'all right? You know, how do you, and we say it's the spirit. Well, it's something like the whole argument about Japhet. Like, we can bring out as much history as we want. We can bring out the prophecies, which that's really the determining factor. But at the end of the day, it's just something that has to be received in the spirit. And the authority was given unto the men of the Lord to apply these things. Okay? That, hopefully I'll edify on to the next. Shalom.